And that's where I think people that are not instrument rated make some very serious errors in judgment, is thinking that I got away with this the last time or the last 10 times. But weather is never the same. Yes, I know in the Midwest we have snowstorms and we have ice, and in the summer we have thunderstorms, but each individual chunk of weather is different than the one that came before and the one that's probably coming after. So if they look similar, it's probably a coincidence more than anything else.
Hello again, and welcome to the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm Max Trescott, and this is our weekly show dedicated to everything general aviation, such as news and safety tips for pilots and student pilots like you. Now, today's show is a Safety Moment episode with Flying Magazine senior editor Rob Mark, who will walk us through some recent VFR into IMC accidents. We're going to talk about how to avoid getting into these kinds of accidents, and also what to do if you accidentally fly into a cloud. Now, last week in episode 105, I talked about 8 lessons that pilots can learn from the Boeing 737 Max crashes. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And by the way, I'm teaching a new free seminar called So You Want to Learn to Fly or Buy a Cirrus, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the show. It's the perfect seminar for you if you have just started to think about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or if you'd like flight training in one. If that describes you, there are so many things I can help you with, so just please give me a call today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now let's get to our safety moment with Rob Mark. And please stick around to the very end, because after Rob and I finish, I'm going to add a few thoughts on the topic that he and I didn't discuss, and I'll also point you to some online resources about avoiding VFR into IMC accidents. Here's our conversation. And to help us here today, we're talking with Rob Mark. Now, Rob is uniquely qualified to help as he is the senior editor for Flying Magazine, and he runs the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com. And he's one of the few people in the world who's worked as both an air traffic controller and an airline pilot. Rob, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me again, Max.
Hey, so like me, I know that you go to look at accidents from time to time, and I recently went out to the NTSB to see what new final accident reports had been released. And I was really surprised there was a whole cluster of VFR into IMC accidents, and I probably shouldn't have been surprised because AOPA says that about half of all weather-related accidents are a result of continuing VFR into IMC. And of course, these are the most deadly type of any accident, because almost all of them end up fatal. About 90% of these kinds of accidents result in fatalities. So let's start by looking at this first accident here in Meeker, Colorado.
I think this one is pretty interesting because, of course, it's at night in instrument conditions, except that this private pilot was not instrument rated. And then he's up there around 18,000 feet, getting himself into the clouds, and there are just so many judgment issues, I think, that jumped out at me. Certainly his home-built oxygen system for being up at that, so he could fly at that altitude. And again, flying in the mountains at night in possible IFR. Boy, this one's just beyond me.
Yeah, I was kind of struck, too, by the fact that he had not just an oxygen bottle with him, but it was kind of built into the airplane. And he was up here, he'd been up in the 17,000 feet area. ATC told him that he's going to need a IFR clearance if he were to go above 18,000 feet. They asked him if he was IFR capable and rated, and the pilot responded, "That would be great. I just want to get over this so I can get back down." You know, this is not the first time I've read about an accident where a controller asked a pilot if he was IFR rated, and the pilot said, "Yeah, sure, let's go with it."
I've never quite understood if it's because they think, "Oh my gosh, I'm caught. What should I say? I better just tell them I can do it," thinking that, oh, it's a piece of cake to just fly the airplane on instruments. You just look at these little gauges or dials, or at very worst, I just turn on the autopilot and it does it for me, and it's so easy.
I've always wondered, is it a pilot who's overconfident and thinks, yeah, this can't be that hard. I've I had 3 hours of hood work while getting my private, so what's the big deal? Or is it, as you say, someone who kind of feels like, oops, I've been cornered, I better pretend that I'm an instrument-rated pilot? But these accidents, I mean, these situations always end up the same way with dead people.
I would be surprised if, going back to look at this pilot's flying history, there weren't some other situations in which he had perhaps taken some questionable judgment moves and flown in weather that was beyond what he could normally handle, and most likely got away with it. And that is actually the worst part, because it just fuels that chance or that desire that, hey, I made it work last time. It'll work this time.
Yeah, and it could be that he was having some help from the medications that he was on.
I thought you were going to mention those.
Yeah, exactly. They list 4 different things, and I looked up what each was used for treating. The first one, it says it's used to treat anxiety, muscle spasm, and seizures. The next one says it can treat pain. The next one said it can treat pain and stiffness caused by muscle spasms. And the fourth one said it can treat insomnia.
So this guy was high as a kite before he got in the airplane.
Yeah, and the NTSB said it's likely that the combined effects of the 6 impairing substances he used contributed to his unsafe decision-making, which led him to initiate the flight in the dark, over mountainous terrain, in instrument meteorological conditions, and without ensuring ready access to his oxygen system.
It's sad to read this, but of course, I guess what I ask, or what I wonder is, what could you possibly do to try to slow somebody like this down? I mean, there are so many risks that this man took this particular night alone that I can't even imagine saying, well, if he'd only done this or if he had only done that, this wouldn't have happened, because it seemed like this man's fate was almost sealed before he took off.
Yeah, and here's another factor we haven't even talked about. The weather models at the time indicated icing. They said both clear, rime, and mixed indicated between 9,000 and 14,000 feet, which were the temperatures that he had flown through to get up to 18,000 feet. So he was flying in icing conditions as well. I was intrigued by his experience level. The pilot is 62 years old, had a private pilot certificate, no instrument rating. He had reported in 2015, which was about 2 years before the accident, a total of 600 hours of flight experience, with 20 hours in the previous 6 months. And, it just seems to me that anybody with 600 hours, they could have taken the time somewhere along the line to get an instrument rating.
It probably wasn't important enough to this person to do that. But also, even if you didn't have an instrument rating, any of us with an instrument rating would have said, a nighttime mountain flight in areas where the minimum en route altitudes are probably in the 13 to 14,000 foot range, and the weather is calling for icing above 14 in the clouds, would say, nah, this is not a good night. Let's do this tomorrow. And it's that simple. But when you have for whatever reason, a drug-induced ego that says, I can handle that. I don't see what the defense for that could be. At least he didn't take anybody with him.
Yeah, exactly. And I just kind of wonder, as I think you alluded to this earlier, if perhaps he had skirted the clouds before, if he'd had encounters before and they had all worked out. Sometimes I think people think that, hey, I got away with it the prior 20 times, no problem on the 21st time trying the same thing.
And that's where I think people that are not instrument rated make some very serious errors in judgment, is thinking that I got away with this the last time or the last 10 times. But weather is never the same. Yes, I know in the Midwest we have snowstorms and we have ice, and in the summer we have thunderstorms, but each individual chunk of weather is different than the one that came before and the one that's probably coming after. So if they look similar, it's probably a coincidence more than anything else.
Yeah, and we should just mention how this ended for the gentleman. After he said that, sure, let's go with this IFR flight plan, it says, during subsequent communications with ATC, the pilot's communications became inconsistent and the airplane began flying erratically with changes in direction and altitude. During the final minutes of flight, the airplane entered a series of descending turns before experiencing an in-flight breakup. So that's a pretty terrible way to go. And I wonder if perhaps pilots in general are just optimistic. I mean, we have to be to some extent because we know we're facing some risk, and yet we take off and we fly anyway. I think that private pilots underestimate how difficult it is to fly once you get into the clouds. You've certainly heard of the video, I would imagine, 178 seconds to live.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, they did a series of studies with private pilots in a simulator, and on average, it was just under 3 minutes. So once they went into the clouds in the simulator, where they lost control and basically had an accident.
And it is funny that we're talking about this. I was talking this morning to somebody else about upset prevention and recovery topics and techniques, and it's amazing how little time they have between the time a pilot can recognize an unusual situation and the time they have before the airplane exceeds its limitations. And there was a NASA Boeing study this person mentioned to me that said it's between 6 and 10 seconds before a pilot in an upset will do something to make the airplane come unglued. And sometimes it's doing the wrong thing. Sometimes it's by doing nothing. And either one, you don't have a lot of time. And I agree. Going into IFR, if you've never been in a cloud before, good grief. I can't imagine that the first time.
Well, just to kind of wrap up on this one, this occurred in January 14th, 2016. It was a Beech C-35, happened at 0045 UTC in Meeker, Colorado. We'll, of course, include a link to it in the show notes. So, Rob, let's move on. What do we have as our next VFR and IMC accident?
Well, I think the next one that I thought was interesting was this Trinidad. A Cicada TB-20 encountered IMC on a VFR flight in Sierraville, California. Now, I don't know, you know that area better than I. Where is Sierraville?
Yes, so this is up in the Sierras, no surprise, which is the mountain range along the entire eastern border of California. I think this town is located north of Truckee, which I believe was the airport that she departed from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she didn't get very far, did she?
No, not very far after all. In this particular case, 17 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft was just 19 miles northwest of the airport before it collided with terrain.
And it makes you wonder what was going on as the reference point for the pilot moves from, oh, the visibility's not bad, I can see way out there, to I can't see very far in front of the wing, and it looks like I'm looking straight down. I guess that's another one I don't understand, is that how people can watch something like that sneaking up on them and not say, this isn't right.
So she was flying a route that she had flown a couple of times before, and so that might have increased her confidence. However, her total time, pretty low. She had 191 hours at the time of the accident. And I should mention that Truckee and Sierraville are highly embedded in the mountains. You know, the mountain peaks in that area go well over 11,000, maybe 12,000 feet. The airport takeoff would be just a little below 6,000 feet. So she had quite a bit of ways to climb. Now, the weather was not that great at the time that she left. She had talked with her partner in the aircraft about whether or not she should go or not. He had advised her to contact flight service. And in fact, in the report here, it says the co-owner further reported that on the day before the accident, he received a text message from the pilot that read, "Tomorrow is looking iffy on getting out," followed by, "I think I'll have a window or two to get out." And on the day of the accident, the pilot called the co-owner and asked the opinion of the flight and whether or not she might be able to fly on top of the clouds. And the co-owner told the pilot not to try it. Additionally, the co-owner suggested that she stay overnight, but the pilot did not want to do that. You know, I think often when we fly, that we look at the inconveniences that may occur by postponing a flight because of weather. And yet, usually, that inconvenience is mild compared to the inconvenience of having an accident.
Well, absolutely. And I think, again, people that, are new to flying perhaps really do not understand something that we learned a long time ago. You can kill yourself in an airplane if you make a couple of really bad decisions at any point during the flight. We focus on the glorious kind of flying that we do, and we love it, and it's great, and it's fun, and it's exciting. But you can't lose sight of the fact that this is a machine that if you don't treat it well or try to get it to do things that, your brain can't keep up with, you are going to hurt yourself. Just as if you had a brand new car and you decided to take the exit ramp off the 405 at 80 miles an hour on a rainy afternoon. It's not a good idea.
And I was just looking at the automated weather for Truckee around the time that she took off. Visibility was 6 to 10 statute miles, which, sounds fine if you're down in the flatlands, but remember, we're here deep in the mountains. Ceiling was broken at 3,400 AGL. Now, that airport sits a little below 6,000 feet, so we add 3,400 to that. That means the clouds were up a little over 9,000 feet. Well, the mountains continue up to 11,000, 12,000 feet. So she really had very few outs. It's surprising to me that she would even think that it would be possible to sneak out through the mountains and the valleys with the clouds that low.
And that's part of the strategy here that I never understand. Maybe it's because I was a Fed for too long, but I always imagine myself when I have one of those situations that I go, should I do this? And I always think, okay, I did it, but I got caught. How do I explain this to a FSDO guy at the other end when he says, so tell me what you were thinking about when you did this? And I realized, I really wouldn't have much of a defense other than I was really stupid. So I tend to, maybe you call that fear. I don't know. Call it what you want. I just know that I think it's not a bad theory to keep in mind. And it's worked for me for a long time, and I'm still here to talk about it. But again, imagine this lady taking off. I guess I was imagining this woman calling me and saying, what do you think? And I'd say, well, forget me for a minute. You're the one taking the flight. Why are you calling me? You obviously don't feel real warm and fuzzy about this, do you? Well, no, not really. Okay, there's a reason. There's some part of your brain that says, don't do this, and you're ignoring it. And unfortunately, that is how people end up losing their lives.
And I use something very similar, by the way. If I have faced some type of flight where it just doesn't look safe, I think about how would the accident report read? And I don't want to be so embarrassed to have people at my funeral going, yeah, Max was a really great pilot. What was he thinking this day when he did that? And that has certainly prevented me from continuing flights where, the outcome was unknown. Now, she had made it up to at least 8,800 feet. That was the last radar hit on her aircraft. And then she looked like she must have been heading back toward the airport because she impacted terrain at 7,697 feet. And you can imagine once you get caught in the snow and ice and clouds and so on, it's going to be incredibly disorienting, and knowing exactly, which way to turn to get out of that when you're in valleys between mountains. Wow, that's got to be pretty scary.
And I think too that when you're in the clouds and you're an instrument pilot, there's no point in looking out the window. There's no point in looking down because you're not going to see anything. And it just distracts you anyway and increases the chance of vertigo. But perhaps she was beneath the clouds and perhaps she was in snow showers. Who knows? But all you need are those occasional glimpses of the ground. I grant you, we don't know that happened here, but if those occasional glimpses of the ground were popping up on her every so often, I have found it makes it even worse. It's kind of like seeing the clouds starting to break when you're headed down to minimums on an instrument approach, and somebody says, oh, I've got ground contact. I don't care about ground contact. Can you see the runway or the lights? No. Okay, then I don't care what you see because it's only going to screw us up.
Yes, I agree. Being able to just see a little bit of ground is so distracting because it draws your eye out of the airplane and it really gives you a bit of hope. And at that point, it's so easy to end up in an unusual attitude because you're looking outside. You don't have a level horizon. The clouds are sloping. It's just incredibly disorienting. So you're right. It's much better to not be able to see anything. Just keep your eyes in the airplane and, stare at the instruments. One of the things I figured out many, many years ago back when I lived in New Jersey, I took a flight up to Massachusetts one weekend just to, say that I'd gone to a different state. It was just kind of fun to go someplace new. And when I started, visibility was probably, 15, 20 miles. And at some point in time, I suddenly realized, whoa, visibility has dropped to maybe, 7 miles. And what I realized is that humans are extremely poor at recognizing gradual change. And it's just so easy to have conditions change slowly and not even notice how much worse they've gotten.
Oh, absolutely. And that is what we were talking about with that earlier accident, the potential that when you can see the horizon over the nose of the airplane, everybody feels pretty warm and fuzzy. But then as you notice the horizon supposedly starting to get closer and closer to the nose of the airplane, or even to the point where you can just see it out of the corner of your eye and it looks like it's almost straight down, those are signals. And that's what you get paid for as a pilot, even if you're not being paid, to notice. And this lady apparently didn't notice them until it was too late. And unfortunately, she did take somebody with her.
She did, yeah. She was headed to Petaluma, which is right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I think was her home airport. And I think that pilots who learn to fly here down in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the terrain is relatively flat, don't fully appreciate how difficult it is to operate when you're in mountainous terrain that runs up to 11,000, 12,000 feet. It seems to me that generally most of the accidents that we see up in the mountains are actually flatlanders, pilots from down here near the coast who get in trouble when they're in the mountains.
I don't doubt that, and I don't really have much mountain flying experience at all, but I can guarantee you that if I were out in that area, the first thing I would do is take another instructor that has experience and say, okay, here's what I want to do. Now, please keep an eye on me and tell me about all the potential risks here that I might not even be thinking about as I just try to avoid the rocks. I think it takes a pretty determined pilot to be able to say, I know I don't know anything about this, and I think I need some help. That goes back to their ego, I think. The old, it's not that big a deal. It still flies. I can handle it.
Yeah. One of the things when I do mountain checkouts with pilots here in this area is suggest to them that whatever their personal minimums may be, maybe their personal minimums are that they're going to require at least, 6-7 mile visibility and the clouds be up at least 2,000 feet above the ground. When you go into the mountains, you really ought to at least double those numbers. Look at 15-mile visibility, look at clouds are maybe 4,000 feet above the ground. In this particular case, you might want even more than that since the Truckee Airport is more than 4,000 feet below the mountaintops.
Absolutely. And I think another, in fact, I was out in Palm Springs a few weeks ago, and it was beautiful VFR, and a friend of mine was going to come from San Diego up through, I can't remember the pass there that's just northwest of Palm Springs, and come through that way. And that pass...
That would be the Banning Pass.
The Banning Pass.
Exactly.
I knew that. Actually, I didn't remember, but so when I took off the next day on the airline going back home, I said, "Oh, I can see that pass. I can see how that would be great because the pass is almost down at sea level. I mean, the bottom of it, but it's not that wide. Couple miles wide, maybe 4 miles or something. But boy, on either side, the rocks go up pretty steeply, and they go up, I think, 10 or 11,000 feet." And if you can't see all of that, why in God's name would you be trying to get through that kind of a situation, knowing that there are rocks out there waiting to get you? I just don't understand that.
So in my more than 40 years of flying, I've had severe turbulence 4 times, and one time was right there. Now, I was up fairly high, the top of the mountain just north of Palm Springs, I believe tops out around 13,000. I was on a Cessna 210, and I was probably at 12.5, just kind of adjacent to the side of that hill. And as I descended down over Palm Springs, boy, everything in the airplane started flying around on the inside. It is not fun to be in severe turbulence where everything is flying around the airplane and it's hard to control it.
Well, I think you have to remember, too, that flying airplanes for people that have experience, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. It's just that sometimes I've had people say, well, you make it look easy. Well, it is to a degree, but that's because our eyes are moving all the time. We're looking at the instruments. We're looking at the engine gauges. We're looking out the window. we're looking at the passengers, we're checking our navigation process, we're looking at the instruments again, and we're actually moving constantly, and our brain is updating every few seconds, but it doesn't look physically like we're doing a lot of work. And I think that if people are out flying in deteriorating weather and they need to wait until it's so bad that they can't imagine what else to do, their mind was someplace else to start with.
Yeah, I agree. And it may be a situation of feeling like they had to get to their destination. I think one of the biggest traps for pilots is believing that their passengers will be disappointed if they don't get them to their destination at the date and time planned. Whereas if you were to really tell your passengers realistically, what the threats were that you were facing, they would be perfectly content to go, yeah, let's spend another day at the hotel. We'll leave tomorrow when the weather is better.
Absolutely. And I would always say that, yes, you know what, Max, we can't get through this today. And, I'm sorry. I know you're disappointed. But you know what? We're still here talking about it. Yeah. Disappointment doesn't usually kill people.
No, certainly doesn't. Well, this particular accident occurred on April 17th, 2017, almost exactly 2 years ago, Trinidad in Sierra, California. So what's our third accident for today?
Another non-instrument rated pilot that had two people on board with him departed in instrument conditions in a turbocharged Cessna 182, and he entered the clouds at 400 feet above the ground. 400 feet above the ground. He was non-instrument rated, and it didn't turn out very well, did it?
Now, this accident was in Thief River Falls, Minnesota, with a retractable 182. And again, this was a pilot who had a significant amount of time. I believe he had around 800 hours of experience, and he had flown 16 hours in the prior 30 days. This was a 69-year-old male. Now, he was headed off to Rawlins, Wyoming, which is almost exactly 600 miles away. He had just made that trip twice in the prior 5 days. He flew from Rawlins to drop off some passengers at Thief River Falls, and then he flew back home, and then he flew out the previous day from Rawlins to pick these people up from Minnesota and fly them back. And what's amazing is that he took off as a private pilot when the weather was overcast at 400 feet. Now, the prior day coming in, he told people that the weather was bad and he had to fly under the cloud layer, and he apparently told somebody at the local hotel he stayed at that he flew at 1,500 feet above ground level to stay under a cloud level. There's a big difference between flying at 1,500 feet and flying below 400 feet. I don't know if you've noticed out in the Midwest where you live, even though it's flat out there, these things that stick up to 2,000 feet with wires hanging off of them.
Oh, absolutely. And those are the ones that I always worry about when I'm flying, even especially in the best VFR conditions, because that's when you can become very, very complacent and say, oh, I can see forever, except right there where I missed the guy wires on this 1,700-foot AGL radio tower out in northeast Kansas or something like that. But again, to take off in an airplane with no instrument rating and somehow not understand that the ceiling was 400 feet is just, I can't even imagine what was going through that pilot's minds. I mean, you know what it's like when you're on the ground and you're watching the clouds go by before you take off. There's a big difference between, it looks like it's maybe 3,000 or 4,000 foot overcast and 400 feet. I mean, it is so very clearly different.
And I wonder if perhaps he thought that he could get on top of the clouds. He was only in the air for a total of 4 minutes. Now, there was a Garmin handheld GPS that was found in the wreckage, and the NTSB took a look at the data, and they said that the aircraft climbed and descended several times. They said about 2 minutes after takeoff, the airplane descended to 250 feet AGL and then quickly climbed to 1,400 feet AGL. The airplane then circled in the vicinity of the accident site in a right descending turn. So, perhaps that was his strategy to try and get back under the clouds after he determined that he could not get on top of the clouds, but not a very good strategy.
There's a reason people have an instrument rating, I think. Flying the airplane, it's very similar to the way that you fly when you're VFR. You need full power for takeoff, and once the airplane is broken ground, you get the flaps up, you clean it up, and you climb. Except the difference for us is that you can't see anything out the windows. And that plays tricks on your brain. And unfortunately, until people start their instrument training, they often don't think it's that big a deal. And the first time you're in the clouds and the instructor says, I'll take off that stupid hood or the foggles you have on and see what you think. And you realize I'm looking out the windows, but there's absolutely nothing there except in this case, maybe the strut holding the wing up on that 182. And that's about as far away as you can see. And your mind is just completely disoriented based on what you've come to learn up to that point. And you need to be ready for that before you enter the clouds.
Well, also, I think sometimes people figure, hey, they had 3 hours of hood time as they were getting their private, and gosh, how much do you really need to go fly into a cloud? Well, that's nothing compared to the 40 hours that you need to get to an instrument rating. In fact, I would say there's probably a danger in giving those 3 hours of instruction because it might leave pilots confident that they could handle an encounter with clouds when in fact they can't. If we gave people 0 hood time as a private pilot, they would work a lot harder to stay outside of the clouds, I think.
I wonder about that myself. And I somehow you would think, too, that most likely the people that are killing themselves in airplanes like this are not the kind of people that are going to listen to your show, nor are they probably the people that will go up on the NTSB website and read any of those accident reports, nor are they the kind of people that would probably be AOPA members and be up on the Air Safety Institute site looking at the incredible stories that they tell visually with how they got themselves into that situation with one bad decision after another.
Well, and I think sometimes there are pilots who are good pilots and who are careful and then occasionally find themselves backed into a corner and let their own good judgment be led astray and kind of figure, well, this one time, it's doing these things at one time can really get you into a whole heap of trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Because as I said earlier, at least to me, the weather that you see today is going to be different from what you're going to see in a week or even another day. They may have similar characteristics, but they may not get you to behave quite the same way. Because let's face it, too, we don't know what was going through this pilot's mind when he took off. Was he rushed? Perhaps. Was he in a situation where he said, well, I've got to get there with these people. I've done this a couple of times recently. It's not that big a deal. And I got to go. And sometimes we can talk ourselves into almost anything.
And I think that's what this accident has in common with the Trinidad accident that we were just talking about in Sierra, California. Both pilots in both of these accidents had made the same trip fairly recently, and conditions were a little bit better, but now they were worse. And so I think this pilot must have thought, gee, I was able to fly successfully to Thief River Falls yesterday. I stayed at 1,500 feet. Gee, it can't be that much different today, but it very much was. There was one other thing that kind of caught my attention here. When you go flying, what do you do for charts these days, for sectional charts? I'm
using my iPad.
Mm-hmm. So you have one of the apps like ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot?
I do.
Yeah. This pilot, after landing the day before, he asked the local fixed base operator, the FBO owner, about whether he could obtain a local sectional chart from them. But the FBO did not have any charts for sale. The FBO owner later found an expired chart that the pilot accepted.
I cannot imagine how a VFR sectional chart would have changed anything for this pilot. I really can't.
No, I don't think so either, but I think perhaps it shows an attitude toward flying, which to me is a little surprising. In this day and age, you can have one subscription and have every chart for the entire country, as opposed to what we had to do over 10 years ago, where it was really difficult if you're flying a long trip to get all the charts you need for every step along the way. So it just suggests to me that this pilot hadn't really kept up with the state of the art.
I realize it's too bad that these people weren't here to tell us what they were thinking. But imagine if we could interview people and said, so take me through the process. Explain to me how you got to a point where you thought that you as a non-instrument pilot could safely complete this trip. I would just love to see what the similarities were between these pilots.
Yeah, and I think perhaps all of these pilots were naive, and there may still be private pilots out there listening to us who think, hey, what's the big deal? You're just flying in the clouds. And it is a big deal. It is far harder than you could possibly imagine, and the outcomes are pretty poor, and it's pretty well documented.
However, with the proper training, it can become much easier. But it's still not a snap. I mean, if it was just a snap to make this all work, you wouldn't have so many people punching the autopilot button, as the gear comes up into the wells on some of these airplanes.
So let's talk about some of the commonality among these accidents. I mean, for sure, it doesn't sound like any of these people were using the autopilot. Now, in at least one case, the woman who was going up the valley here in the Sierras, having the autopilot wouldn't have kept her out of the terrain if she was down low between the valleys. But certainly it could have helped the other two pilots.
It certainly could have, but then just because an airplane has an autopilot doesn't necessarily mean that the pilot understands how to operate it and when to operate it and how to maneuver the airplane using the heading bug or the rate of climb wheel or anything else. But there are a lot of people that say, I'm heading this way, I'm climbing, and I'm going to hit autopilot, and it'll probably just keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, and to be frank, I would bet that 50% of the GA aircraft in this country either don't have an autopilot or don't have an autopilot that's trustworthy.
Yeah, we're not talking about a co-pilot either, But no, that I don't doubt that. And you need to learn to fly without an autopilot. You need to learn to fly on instruments without an autopilot, and you need to become familiar with flying on and off the autopilot, especially in instrument conditions, because if you're in bad weather, the bottoms are 500 feet and you're being vectored for the approach and the autopilot dies on you, what do you do now? You say, oh, sorry, I wasn't trained for that. No, you have to figure out what to do, and you better be proficient at hand flying the approach.
So what are some of the common things you see among all of these three reports we've just talked about?
Oh, I think the decision, to me at least, what jumps out on all of them are the pre-flight decision-making, because I think all of these people seem to have been warned somewhere early on, before they ever even took off, that there might be some problems there. And it seems like either they did not heed those warnings, or they, for some reason, decided they were up to the task. Now, if I were flying VFR and I had an instrument rating, and I somehow accidentally went in the clouds, I can go, that was really stupid. And I'll keep the wings level, pull power back, and get down out of the clouds. But I mean, it's not that simple when you're not aware of what flying into the clouds is like. I'd be very curious to see how much actual instrument time, if any, during their training as pilots they have had.
Yeah, and certainly depending on the type of clouds you're in, you can get a lot of turbulence, which makes it that much harder to fly as well. So let's just talk about how to avoid VFR into IMC accidents to begin with. I think you've kind of touched base on the first one, and that's the pre-flight planning.
Well, I think one thing that we have to be honest about is that the risk of VFR into IMC rises considerably at night, because you just simply cannot see what's coming at night, even if the visibility is good. You might perhaps notice some precip up ahead and say, gee, the lights look funny this way, but they look better to the left and the right, that's a clue that something is unusual up there. And the question is, what do you do about it? But you have to be ready for that, much more so, I think, at night than during the daytime.
Thinking about these accidents, I'm guessing none of these pilots had given a lot of thought to personal minimums because the conditions they took off in exceeded the reasonable personal minimums that most pilots would come up with. Personal minimums, of course, is a concept that the FAA promotes through PAVE, P-A-V-E, as a way to essentially analyze different conditions that you're willing to fly in or not fly in ahead of time so that when you start to encounter them, you recognize and you land. So, for example, we talked earlier, a private pilot might decide that he needs a minimum of 2,000 feet of clouds before taking off for a minimum, 6-mile visibility. I was looking at one site online here, and they suggest having a minimum VFR altitude to continue, suggesting that maybe you need at least 500 feet above all the terrain that you're going to be encountering. And you know what? Frankly, to me, that's low. If the clouds are 500 feet above the terrain, you're not going to be able to stay 500 feet below those clouds. But that could be a trigger where you decide, hey, if I encounter this type of condition, I'm going to make a U-turn, I'm going to make a 180, and I'm going to go land somewhere. I had a flight a while back with somebody. We're bringing a new airplane back across the country from Virginia, and he wanted to continue on sometime just before sunset. And I said, no, the conditions aren't that great. And he says, well, okay, if I see any lightning, then we'll turn around and come back. We took off. Sure enough, he saw some lightning and continued. And I said, hey, you had a minimum the threshold that you set, and you violated it. So we got him to make the U-turn and come home. But I think if pilots aren't constantly thinking about what are these thresholds beyond which they won't go, and then acting upon those triggers, it's very easy just to continue on and hope that things work out.
And I have seen that in students as well. And I'll ask, well, wait a minute. You said if this happened, you were going to take this action, and yet you didn't. Why not? I don't know. Sometimes I've heard them say, well, because you were sitting there, you're not going to let me do something stupid. I said, I guess I didn't I? Because I let you keep going. But I think we are often surprised at the response that people give as to why they keep going on. Well, it doesn't really look that bad. And the lightning's way over there, or the precip is way over this way. And it's as if they're saying, but those rules don't really apply to me.
Well, and I think sometimes they continue simply because they have a flight instructor along with them and they figure, well, what could go wrong? I've got a CFI sitting next to me. But looking at things that people can do to kind of avoid VFR into IMC, we talked about pre-flight planning. We've talked about personal minimums. Another key thing I think is just kind of recognizing when you're about to get into IMC.
It's a very good point. And of course, you have to be constantly looking out the window and noticing that something is changing. But there are certainly times that it could sneak up on you and you're suddenly in the cloud. What do you do now? People say, well, just make a 180. Well, sometimes if you've never practiced turns on instruments, you could make the situation even worse. Maybe the best solution is if you just popped into the clouds, hold the wings level, squeeze some of that power off, start down, provided you're not just 500 feet off the deck, and maybe you'll pop right back out, unless you feel extremely confident about those 180-degree turns.
It certainly depends upon the terrain. I had a training flight years ago where we were relatively close to San Francisco Bay, where there are a few obstacles, and it's at sea level. And we were probably up around 2,000 feet. And despite everything we did, we accidentally popped into a cloud. But it was very simple just to go ahead and gradually, add a little forward pressure to descend out of it, maybe a slight right turn to head toward the bay where we knew that there were no obstacles. So yeah, in some situations, going down can definitely help. Wouldn't have helped our lady pilot in the Sierras, of course, where she's surrounded by terrain. But I think having a plan, first of all, aggressively doing whatever it takes to stay outside of the cloud, but then knowing ahead of time before you go into the cloud, what's your escape route? As you said, is it a 180? Is it go down a little bit, or maybe even it's climb?
And I think another good idea is that when people fly their flight reviews, and I know they're only required every other year, but think about it this way: if the airlines have a near spotless record at this point, I think it's important that you look and say, well, what do they do differently from what we're doing? And what they do differently is they train often, because they realize that training once every 2 years is not enough to embed good practices in your brain, or to keep them in your brain if you ever had them. But, when you go out with an instructor, say, hey, can we practice something like, let's go fly around, and then just all of a sudden, let's just throw on the foggles and pretend I flew into the clouds, and let's, practice some escapes, just to see what it's like, and see how well you do at making that 180-degree turn without losing control of the airplane.
Well, and when you're making that turn, you want to be at something close to standard rate. And I think that's something that private pilots forget, because maybe they haven't been under the hood in so long. If you don't know how to do a standard rate turn, then just limit your bank angle to about 15 degrees of bank. It's going to take a little bit longer to complete the turn, but it's going to be a lot safer. It's going to be a lot easier to keep the aircraft from getting too steep and possibly getting into an unusual attitude.
Oh, but Max, if we make the bank steep, we'll get back out of the clouds that much faster, won't we?
Yeah, let's practice steep turns in the clouds. Those are hard enough to do when you're not in the clouds.
Oh, absolutely. I can remember the first time I was training in a turboprop 30 years ago, and we were training in the actual airplane, and we were training at night, and we got a block of altitude out west of Chicago, and we went in the clouds, and he said, okay, let's go do some steep turns. We're going to do some stall series. And all. I said, in the clouds? He said, yeah, I've never done stalls really in the clouds at night. And but that's when I first realized that professional pilots do it all the time, because they practice it. And it becomes not that big a deal that when the angle of attack is too high in an airplane, even at night in the clouds, the recovery is the same. Reduce the angle of attack and get the airplane back flying. But if you've never tried any of this kind of thing, these are great things that you can try on your next flight review. And I personally, I'm not the FAA, but if it were up to me, I'd say people should be training a minimum of once a year. Not once every 2 years.
And I flew with somebody just a couple of weeks ago who I suggested we put the hood on. And as he was putting on, he said, I have not used this since I went on my private pilot check ride. To which I was thinking, gosh, and why not? You've been flying around for years. Why haven't you brought a safety pilot along and practiced that?
Yeah, it's crazy. And because we think, I don't know. Yeah, I'll do that one of these days. And unfortunately, when you realize you need it and that you hadn't practiced it, I'm sure there's something in the back of your head that says, oh, boy, you should have done that.
Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for talking with us here today about VFR and IMC accidents. And I'm hoping that people who are listening will consider their flying habits, especially if they don't have an instrument rating, and maybe will actually consider going out and getting an instrument rating.
I couldn't agree more, Max. And I hope that maybe some of your listeners who perhaps have been thinking, oh, I can handle that. I'd like them to give you a call or perhaps send an email, and you don't even have to identify them. We don't care who you are. Just tell us what you're thinking about when you make those kinds of decisions, because we're trying to understand it, because we'd like to see fewer people lose their lives in airplanes.
Yeah, we'd much rather talk about other stuff.
Yeah, like fun stuff, like AirVenture or Sun and Fun, when we can go hang out and tell each other lies about things that really never happened, and people appreciate our humor. But these things that we're talking about now are certainly nothing to laugh about.
Indeed. Well, tell folks where they can find more about Rob Mark and the work you do.
Well, they can find me certainly inside the pages of Flying Magazine, which is available on the newsstand. I don't remember the actual cover price. I should. But they'll also find us, they'll find me within the social media areas on at Flying, because we're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and also at jetwine.com, where Scott Spangler and I both write about some interesting ideas every now and again that we hope will be thought-provoking to our readers.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for joining us here for another safety moment.
Thanks, Max.
Well, my thanks again to Rob Mark for helping us sort through these accidents. I have some additional thoughts about these accidents, which I'll get to in a moment, but I did want to mention to new listeners that if you found value in this episode, you can get this podcast downloaded to your phone every week for free by touching the subscribe button on your smartphone. And of course, it's totally free. Also, stick around to the very end, and I'll mention some ways you can become involved with the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now, here are a couple of things I wanted to add to the conversation about these VFR into IMC accidents. After hearing about these accidents, it would be easy for you to think that since the pilots in these accidents made such really poor decisions, that this kind of accident could never happen to you. But there are plenty of examples where pilots made far better decisions than these accident pilots, but still ended up accidentally in the clouds. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, you'll still end up in a cloud. So I encourage you to do whatever it takes to avoid entering a cloud accidentally, and that you should start taking steps to avoid a cloud long before you get close to it. By the way, clouds tend to rise throughout the day as temperatures increase, and it's easy to feel that you're safely above the clouds early in the day, only to find them rising up to meet you. Now, during this episode, we talked about the value of an instrument rating, but if you are instrument rated, don't be lulled into thinking that your instrument rating will save you if you accidentally fly into a cloud. Years ago, I compared accident rates for VFR into IMC for both private pilots versus instrument-rated pilots, and the data did show perhaps a 30 to 40% increase in safety for having an instrument rating when pilots accidentally went into a cloud. So having an instrument rating doesn't mean you will survive a VFR into IMC situation, and there are a couple reasons for this. One is that you might not be instrument current or instrument proficient, and so you're less capable of surviving an encounter with IMC. Also, you might be scud running because you're not instrument current and couldn't legally file IFR. If you were on an IFR flight plan, you'd be flying at altitudes that keep you clear of terrain. But if you're not flying on an IFR flight plan, you have no guaranteed separation from the terrain below you. By the way, you might think, well, I'll never scud run. That's something other pilots do. But here's a simple definition for scud running, and it's probably not what you think. Anytime you're flying VFR in less than VFR minimums, well, then you're scud running. So if you're flying in Class C airspace below 10,000 feet and you have less than 3-mile visibility, or you're within 2,000 feet horizontally of a cloud, yep, you're scud running. So always make sure you continuously meet the VFR visibility and cloud clearance requirements. And if you start to get close to those legal minimums, take early action to avoid accidentally going into a cloud. I want to mention a few links you can find in our show notes by tapping on the artwork in your podcast player or by going to our website at aviationnewstalk.com/106. The first is a link to an Air Safety Institute video called 178 Seconds to Live, which, by the way, is the average time it takes for a private pilot to lose control in the clouds. The next link is to a long article on Skybrary.com called Inadvertent VFR Flight into IMC, and the authors go into even greater depth than Rob and I did about these kinds of accidents and how to avoid them. The next is a link to a NASA callback newsletter in which you can read the stories of 2 pilots who survived encounters with clouds. And finally, there's a link to the Personal Minimums Paved checklist that we talked about with Rob. It'll help you construct your own set of minimums that you can use when you fly. And by identifying these minimums in advance, it's going to make it that much easier for you to recognize when you encounter conditions that are worse than your personal minimums so that you know to turn around or avoid taking off at all. Now, this show is listener supported, so if you'd like to help support the show, please sign up to donate a few dollars every month via credit card by going to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. I try to add a couple of new supporters every month because we lose a few supporters each month when people don't update credit cards or drop out because of changes in their finances. So to donate, just go to the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can also read about the different goodies we'll give you at each of the different support levels. And if you're interested in my new So You Want to Learn to Fly or Buy a Cirrus, there are 2 ways that you can see that seminar. The first is I'll be giving it twice here in Northern California. The first will be on Wednesday, May 8th at the Palo Alto Airport, and the second will be a week later on Wednesday, May 15th at the San Carlos Airport. Both are at 7:30 p.m., and both will be held at the West Valley Flying Club offices at those two airports. If you'd like to attend, please send me an email at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And if you'd like to view the seminar but can't attend perhaps because you live outside the area, I'm going to be turning this into an online course. And if you send me an email, I'll let you know when the online version is available. So if you'd like to take the course online, also send me an email at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, well, it's pretty easy. Just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and have them download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. Just go to the App Store as you would search for any app, type in Aviation News Talk. And of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.